the quiet corners of America, where the roads thin into dirt and the houses sag with age, there are stories you were never meant to hear, stories whispered by crumbling walls buried in shallow graves of memory and locked away in bloodlines too twisted to face daylight. Imagine a home where brothers do not just share a roof or a meal, but one bed and one sister. This is not a tale of fiction. It is the story of a family whose roots have grown so tangled, so sickly, that they strangle everything they touch. Generations folding back in on themselves, a bloodline that tried to keep itself pure, only to rot from within. When you first hear it, you want to dismiss it as a cruel rumor, an ugly exaggeration passed along by gossips. But when you pull back the boards, when you stare into the dark hollow of their lives, you realize the truth is worse than the lie. It begins in isolation, not just the kind of physical distance measured in miles, but a suffocating social distance too. A family cut off by poverty, by shame, and by a silence that no outsider dared to break. Brothers growing into men with nowhere to go, and a sister who became something far more than a sibling. The bed they shared was more than furniture. It was the stage where the family curse played itself out night after night. The whispers of neighbors never came close to the reality of what was happening inside that house. The line between brother and husband, between sister and mother, blurred until it vanished. And the children who came after bore the faces of those sins, each one a living record of how deep the sickness had set. We are told that America is a land of freedom and progress, but in its shadows, entire families lived trapped in cycles of secrecy and survival. This family was not alone. There are others, hidden, unspoken, their stories too grotesque to fit neatly into any history book. Yet, here in this forgotten place, the truth has been left behind like bones in the dirt, waiting for someone to stumble upon it. Tonight, we will open that door. And once you look inside, you may never be able to close it again. The family did not fall into this darkness overnight. It began decades earlier, when land was cheap and neighbors were few. The first generation settled in a hollow that seemed safe, a valley so deep and isolated it may as well have been another country. But what feels like safety can just as easily become a cage. Roads washed out, bridges collapsed, and soon the family found themselves cut off from the world. In their minds, it was providence. They were meant to stay together, to preserve their way of life. But the silence of that valley became the silence of their own undoing. The brothers were raised under a father who did not believe in outsiders. He told them the world beyond the hills was full of liars, thieves, and people who wanted to steal what little they had. To him, marriage outside the family was a betrayal, and women were not daughters so much as property meant to keep bloodlines clean. That word, clean, would come to define their sickness. What he called clean, others would call rotten. Because the more he tried to keep the blood pure, the more disease, deformity, and madness seeped in. The sister at the center of it all never stood a chance. From the moment she was born, her life was written for her. She grew up knowing she would never leave, knowing she belonged not to herself but to the men she called brothers. To them, she was not a sibling, but a resource, a vessel. When the father grew too old to enforce his rules, the sons continued them willingly, because by then, it was all they had ever known. And so, one bed, one sister, became not an accident, but a ritual. When outsiders finally did catch whispers of what was happening, they dismissed it as cruel gossip. Families like this were always spoken of in hushed tones, usually exaggerated into grotesque legends. But here, the legends were not enough. They did not capture the depth of despair echo put into the faces of the children born from that bed. They did not capture the way shame clung to the walls of that home, how the neighbors looked away, pretending not to see what was standing in plain sight. It is not the grotesque that horrifies most, it is the silence. The silence of everyone who knew but said nothing. By the time the second generation grew into adults, the damage was no longer hidden in whispers, it was written across their bodies. Children born from brothers and their one sister often carried the heavy weight of what had been done before they even took their first breath. Crooked spines, misshapen jaws, eyes that didn't quite meet, minds that wandered in places no one could reach. These were not the results of fate or bad luck. They were the living proof of choices made in darkness, repeated year after year, bed after bed. In the small hours of the night, when the house creaked under the weight of its own decay, the children would lie awake, listening to things no child should hear. They knew their world was not like the one in school books, not like the radio voices that slipped through static, speaking of cities, of wars, of a future. Their future was the valley, their inheritance was secrecy, and their blood carried the curse of silence. Some of them tried to run, but when you have never been taught how to belong to the world outside, the world does not know how to receive you. They always came back, dragging shame behind them like chains. The brothers clung to each other, convinced that no one beyond their hollow could ever understand them. They did not see themselves as monsters. They saw themselves as survivors of a world that had long forgotten them. To outsiders, their lives looked grotesque. To them, it was simply what survival demanded. The sister who bore their children did not scream, did not protest. Her silence was her only weapon, and even that dulled over time. In her silence, the curse deepened. As the years stretched on, the family became something like a ghost story. Neighbors warned their children not to wander too close, not to look too long. Passing strangers would say they felt watched, though no one was at the window. The truth was, the famille. Lee had learned to live as shadows, half seen, half spoken of, yet fully present. And in every new child born, the old sins returned, staring back through familiar eyes. The bed never grew cold, the cycle never ended, and the valley held them like a tomb. The deeper you look into this family, the more you begin to realize that their story was never just about them. It was about the land itself, and the way America often turned its back on its most isolated corners. In towns nearby, people whispered, but no one intervened. Poverty was seen as shame, and shame was left to rot in silence. To outsiders, families like this were too far gone, not worth saving. And so the cycle was left to feed on itself generation after generation until it became less a family tree and more a closed loop, branches bending inward until they broke. Inside the house, daily life looked ordinary to the untrained eye. A garden out front, cans stacked neatly in a pantry, clothes mended and hung to dry. But just beneath that thin layer of normalcy lay the secret, the bed shared, the children whose fathers were also their uncles, the sister whose womb became a prison she could never escape. At church, when they rarely went, people stared. Not with outrage, but with a kind of nervous pity, the kind reserved for things too broken to be fixed. No one asked questions. No one wanted to. The brother at the center of it all carried himself as though he were both father and husband. His voice was the law, his shadow stretched across every corner of that hollow. He believed that what happened inside his home was nobody else's business. In his mind, the world had already abandoned them, so why should they play by the world's rules? His children looked to him with a mix of fear and loyalty. They didn't know any other version of family. They didn't know what they were missing, and perhaps that was the cruelest part. Every child born into that house carried two burdens, the blood that tied them too close and the silence that smothered any chance of escape. Neighbors watched from a distance, sometimes catching sight of the children wandering barefoot through fields, their faces pale, their eyes avoiding strangers. Those who dared to look too closely would go home unsettled, sensing something unnatural about them. But unsettling truths are easy to ignore when they do not touch your own family. And so, the silence grew thicker, the valley darker, until the story of this family was less a secret and more a wound, left open and festering beneath the soil of America. By the time the third generation came of age, the sickness had taken on a new form. The children born of brothers and their sister were no longer simply marked by physical deformities or quiet minds. Some grew wild, unpredictable, their tempers flaring into violence at the smallest spark. Others fell into a kind of eerie stillness, their eyes blank, their voices low, as if the weight of the bloodline had pressed all spirit from them. They were not monsters in the way stories often describe, but their existence unsettled everyone who crossed their path. It was as if the valley itself had begun to raise ghosts rather than children. What outsiders fail to understand is that this family believed they had no choice. Poverty closed every door but one, and that door was the one they had always walked through, back to themselves. To take a wife from beyond the hollow meant admitting they were broken, meant inviting in people who would see the truth and carry it back out. To keep their world closed, they chose to close it tighter, sealing themselves away like a wound bandaged too long, festering underneath. It was in this generation that the first serious attempts at intervention began. A teacher from the nearest town raised questions about why the children never seemed to progress in school, why their speech was broken, why their bodies bore signs of sickness beyond their years. But when the authorities arrived, they found little more than a poor family surviving in a poor valley. The rumors of one bed, one sister, were too fragile, too whispered, to hold up under official eyes. With no evidence and no will to dig deeper, the family was left untouched. And once again, silence won. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most, because to listen to this story is to face a kind of truth most people cannot stomach. So tell me in the comments, what would you have do? 1. If this was your bloodline, would you have tried to escape? Or would you have done what they did, cling to each other in the dark, convinced the world would never take you in? The questions linger, heavy and unresolved, because the deeper you go into this story, the harder it becomes to tell where guilt ends and tragedy begins. The brothers, the sister, the children, they were all born into a cycle that had been turning long before them, and once inside, it was almost impossible to step back out. As the years wore on, the family became less a household and more a legend, though one carved in flesh rather than words. Travelers passing through the valley spoke of strange figures at dusk, faces that seemed too similar, movements that felt uncanny. Some said the children looked like echoes of the same person, as if the bloodline had been copied too many times and was beginning to fade. Others swore the silence of that family was louder than any sound, a silence that pressed against your chest when you got too close. In the hollows of America, where myths and truths often intertwine, this family became both. But inside that house, it was not myth, it was survival. Food grew scarcer, work was harder to find, and the outside world grew stranger with each passing decade. Radios carried news of wars, presidents, and inventions that might as well have been fairy tales to them. The brothers grew older, the sister aged before her time, and yet the bed was never empty. Children kept coming, carrying both the weight of survival and the curse of their bloodline. The cycle was no longer hidden, it was etched into their very existence. When strangers came close enough to see the truth, they often turned away, pretending it wasn't there. A visiting doctor once remarked on the uncanny resemblance between every child, but his report never left the county. A preacher once tried to intervene, but after one sermon laced with pointed words, he never mentioned it again. It was as though the valley itself demanded silence, as though speaking the truth would invite some greater curse upon them all. For the family, the outside world was no longer even a consideration. They no longer asked whether what they were doing was right or wrong. It was simply the way things were. When the brothers lay down beside their sister, they did not think of laws or morality. They thought of hunger, of lows, neediness, of survival. When the sister bore yet another child, she did not dream of freedom. She thought of keeping them alive through another winter. To them, this was not horror, it was life. To us, it is almost unthinkable, but therein lies the quiet terror, that what we call monstrous was, to them, simply ordinary. The story of this family does not end with a neat conclusion, because families like these rarely do. They do not vanish in a single act of violence or redemption or rescue. They linger, slowly dissolving into the fabric of forgotten America, until the last of their children are too old to carry on. Then the house caves in, the weeds grow tall, and what was once a living bloodline becomes another ghost story whispered by locals who no longer remember where the truth stopped and where the legend began. But if you look closely, you can still trace the outlines of what happened. Old census records, scattered birth certificates with the same names repeating over and over, graves marked by the same surnames etched again and again. Evidence that tells the story not in words, but in the pattern of repetition, a loop that consumed itself. The names fade, but the pattern does not. And when you see it, you realize this was never just one family. This was one example of a sickness that spread quietly across isolated hollows, where silence reigned and shame ruled stronger than any law. For the family at the heart of this story, the cycle eventually collapsed under its own weight. Too many children sick, too many minds broken, too much shame pressing in. The bed that once bound them together became their undoing. Each generation was weaker than the last, until the family no longer had the strength to sustain itself. Outsiders occasionally took in one or two of the children, but they never stayed long in the world beyond the valley. They carried the shadow with them, a reminder that blood carries more than life. It carries history, memory, curses that are not easily washed away. And so, when you hear whispers of brothers sharing one bed, of a sister bound not by choice but by blood, remember that it is not just their story, it is a mirror, a reminder of what silence can allow to grow in the dark, a reminder that families can rot from the inside long before anyone dares to look, and above all, it is a reminder that the past is never truly buried. It waits, patient and watchful, in valleys and in bloodlines, ready to be uncovered by anyone willing to look long enough, because some truths once found can never be forgotten.